Next, never insert a cannula into a bleeding hole and use your instrument to tamponade the bleeding. So what can we do to reduce the risk with cannulas even further? I think sometimes we're drawn to digital things that we can measure. Is it either a cannula or a needle? But there are many analog factors that the injector can control, which I believe will affect risk. Most obvious of all might be just being gentle. So when you're using a cannula, remember that force over area is pressure. If you apply less force, you're going to be putting less pressure on those vessels and you're far less likely to penetrate into the lumen of an artery. Find that path of least resistance instead of pushing through with force. Next, never insert a cannula into a bleeding hole and use your instrument to tamponade the bleeding. I've seen this often, even on stage. Injectors quickly put the needle into the bleeding hole to try and stop it and then complete their procedure. In certain areas of the face, that's highly risky, I believe. That bleeding could be coming straight from an artery that you've literally placed your cannula straight into. Next, I would recommend is that you assess the mobility of your cannula. So before injecting, check that it moves easily. I've done this on a cadaver study where you basically place the cannula into a vessel and you can feel it's different. The fat gives way to the cannula and the cannula moves much more easily than if it's placed in a vessel. And if you routinely do this before you start injecting, it's one more test that may help you detect when your cannula has gone into the wrong place. You can also make sure that the cannula is in the right place by observing for a small raise before you start injecting. I like to sense that the filler is expanding outwards because I know if you're in a vessel, it travels down the lumen. You'll sometimes see this when you're injecting forehead botulinum toxin. As you inject, it almost disappears. You don't get that usual bleb that I usually see, and that sometimes is associated with a flash of white. So I've seen this a few times as I'm injecting, and it definitely responds differently than when you're in the right place. Now, it doesn't matter with botulinum toxin, but it can make a difference, a huge difference if that's filler. So if you're injecting and you don't see the skin raise up where it should, stop injecting immediately and make sure that you're not in a vessel. I've also discovered that aspiration works with cannulas. I made an assumption many years ago that there would be no point to aspirate, and my colleague, Dr. Amy Clark, decided to test it as any good clinician should, and she discovered in her coffee one day that it aspirates perfectly well with the products that we use. Not with all products, but with particularly the Vicross range of dermal fillers, we know that they work with most cannulas. And this is one more step. Now, it's not going to be useful everywhere, but particularly if you're in a tight space and there's not a lot of ability to do your other tests, it may be one more thing that reduces the risk a little bit of being in a vessel. If you are injecting in a high-risk area, remember that decreasing severity is one of your goals, not just frequency. So I also recommend compressing any vessels which you know are leading towards the eye as you're injecting in a high-risk area. I have no idea whether this is actually going to work, but it makes sense to me. If you compress, for example, the supratrochlear notch as you're injecting near the nose, there is less room for a filler to make its way into the place where we least want it to go. And why not add the simple extra step?